So, so yeah, as Elaine said, we have been, myself and another colleague in Green Schools were engaging with IDEA for a long time now, and we were actually at the launch of the Code of Good Practice, the Code of Good Practice in December 2019, and we were very enthusiastic about it and thinking that we could embed this in green schools, in the global citizenship education aspect of green schools. But then we're told, oh, this needs to be a whole organization thing. So, yeah, we were very enthusiastic about it and started working on trying to bring this into all the different programs that the education unit at the time delivered. So I didn't realize that it was going to be this long of a game to create change, but but it has been a very good experience, I have to say. So to understand why the Code of Good Practice matters to me, you kind of need to understand um, the problems I ran into at the start as well. So when An Taisce joined IDEA and began to receive funding from Irish Aid for particularly the global citizenship aspect of the Green Schools program, I was coming from a world of environmental education and education for sustainable development. And that's the language I spoke, my organization spoke, and that is what our programs are built around. But then the sector I was stepping into was called development education. And for a while, there was a real disconnect, not in the values and not in the practice, but in the vocabulary in particular. For example, the second time I wrote an Irish Aid proposal, I actually ended up having to rewrite the whole proposal in development education language. So I basically wrote the same thing, but copied and pasted phrases from the Irish Aid strategy into the grant proposal. And, I have since continued to receive funding, but there was this real disconnect between the language that both organizations spoke. So it took time, conversations, lots of documentations, alignment of work before the external world said, yes, what you do is GCE. Yes, it counts. Yes, you belong here. I actually never forget the first time Frank, who was the director of IDEA then, called called out that ESD was along the lines of development education as well, and that was a lovely moment. So then the moment of the Code of Good Practice became possible to pursue seriously. But then came the twist, having just convinced the outside world that ESD was linked to GCE, that we were doing development education all along. I now had to walk back into my own building and make the same argument in reverse. So I had to say to colleagues who had spent years on green schools, climate education, on sustainability, what you do is also development education and also addresses global justice issues. And the response was, as you might imagine, not always very warm. So in March, actually, the day we were told to stay home because of the pandemic 2020, we had arranged an in-person meeting with program managers to outline what the code is and to get them on board to provide information for our first self-assessment. So they did, and I then had, of course, plenty of time to put it all together as we were all at home. We flew through the first year, so of course we had to do two self-assessment in that first year. Not all managers reported or saw the value in it, to be honest with you. So some of them didn't engage at all, but we had enough to go with. So with ideas, so we put in our self-assessment that year in August 2020, I think was our first self-assessment. And with ideas, first feedback narrowing the scope of the report into just 45 programs because what we gave them was so much. We tried to report on, I think there was something like 11 programs going in the unit at the time, so it was too much. So they asked us to narrow the scope to just a few of the programs. So in November 2022, I presented the Code of Good Practice for the first time to our full staff team, and I felt I needed to kind of open in a way that named the resistance without putting people on the defense, because I knew what I was walking into, because I had just come out of a reversed, the way it was reversed. So I knew there would be people in that room thinking, this is nothing to do with me. Phoebe being one of them. She will probably explain there later. My program is environmental. We don't do development education. So I ended up just putting a picture of an elephant on the screen with the caption, "Let's talk about the elephant in the room, but we don't do DE." So I got a laugh, and I think that laugh was important because, if people laugh, they listen, and when they're listening, you have at least a chance. So I presented the work on the Code of Good Practice through photographs of where the work each program was already doing fits in with the principles of the code. And the pitch I then went with, that I then made, was quite simple. I'm not asking you to do something new. I'm asking you to describe what you already do, using a framework that connects it to a wider movement, opens the door to funding, and positions An Taisce in the GCE sector more credibly. And most importantly, it acts as a reflective framework for the work that we do to continuously make improvements in what we do. So some people did get it immediately, but others were skeptical. Even a few were outright resistant, protective of their program identities, uncertain about the extra workload, or just unconvinced that this was their responsibility. So I ended up doing another whole staff presentation then the following year. And that was also very funny because I was slotted in after Colm O'Regan, who had just performed a comedy sketch about climate action. So he advised me that I might use some of his material to start off, as he mentioned in his sketch, that if you start a conversation with the phrase "as a mother," everyone immediately takes you seriously. So that's how I started. It did get a laugh, but really not too much avail. People were still not invested fully, and those that did report to me did so quite reluctantly. So my conclusion was getting people on board without a mandate from above, without anyone being told that they had to engage, was going to be the hardest part of this whole journey, really. So, so you can have a look at the timeline of a journey on the screen, because I do think the shape of this story is important. What I really want you to notice is that for the first 3 years, this was entirely a solo effort. There was no working group, there was no mandate, no extra time in my contract, nor extra funding or extra pay. The Code of Good Practice basically got done because I kept doing it. Now, it was, at a certain point, I realized that it was a strength, but it was a problem, but also a strength. The problem, it wasn't sustainable, obviously. If it was just one person doing it, if I left, it would stop. But the strength was that I had a body of consistent, documented work that I could take into a room, whether it was a staff meeting, a senior management presentation, or a board meeting, and could actually show how we are connected to this code of good practice. So each of those presentations used a different frame. With staff, it was about identity and relevance, mostly sharing what they did for a principal through photos, to try and create a sense of pride. And then with senior management, I ended up connecting the Code of Good Practice explicitly to our strategy document and our role as SDG ambassadors for the Department of Environment, Energy and Climate. And that language, the strategy, government partnership, SDGs, landed differently than when talking about development education, then when you are talking about development education principles. Now, this, as I said in an earlier slide, it took a lot of work, communications, tremendous support from IDEA through a mentorship program. So that was really great that we had 3 mentorship sessions with Jerry Jeffers at one stage, and also talking to other larger organizations, as Stephen Farrelly is, very important, because he also did this and he put the idea in my head to really start pushing, to start talking to senior management and the board. So so I just kind of then decided that I cannot keep doing this alone. I need a working group. So a year or so later, well, it took a little bit longer, possibly a year and a half, the Code of Good Practice first working group meeting, the CEO attended and commitments were made in the room. But then the question remained open. Those commitments, they were for us to get a seat at the new strategy that we're writing at the table. With that, embedded reporting weren't actioned immediately, not in the weeks or months after. So the silence that followed was its own kind of answer, but we do have some results that I will share with you later. But what I did learn about institutional change, because I really do see this work as institutional change and people thinking about things differently, is that the absence of follow through isn't necessarily the end of the story. It's maybe a signal that the work continues, just maybe at a different level, from making the case to holding the space. So we have been holding the space until last Monday because we had a second working group meeting and a lot of good stuff happened. So then in February, our most recent self-assessment, because I was fortunate to get a delay of 6 months for our reporting for this year because I wasn't where I was with the working group. But we did expand the reporting scope, and for the first time, we included Safer Routes to School team and the advocacy work that we do as well. And that really felt like a great step forward to me. More of the organisation was visible, more of what An Taisce actually does was reflected in the code. There was more actual reflection happening within the organisation. But then the feedback from IDEA that I received was that the quality of the evidence had diluted somewhat, that it was too summative. So by trying to cover more ground, the depth of reporting on each area suffered a bit. So I did find it genuinely useful to read because I do always find that feedback very useful, but also genuinely uncomfortable in equal measures because my instinct, my whole push over the 5 years has been to get more of the organisation involved and to make the code of good practice reflect all of what we do, not just selected slides. But then quality matters, so breadth without depth doesn't serve the code or us. So the question that we are now considering as a working group and have considered at our last meeting is how do we expand the scope without diluting the quality? And yeah, I would be very interested to hear how others have navigated that tension as well. So what we did after that first meeting and the first self-assessment, we started that I found in the past 5 years of this work is that people who aren't in the room and staff who don't attend the presentation or colleagues who don't interact with the code of good practice directly can quite easily just not know it exists. So we decided to create some visual materials to communicate our commitment and progress to the wider office, something that people could actually see. So not a report or a presentation, but a visual signal that this is something An Taisce has signed up to. And we are planning to do this every year. We have the Code of Good Practice posters up on the wall in the kitchen where people can see it visually, can talk about it. And then we are going to print these posters out as well to share the fantastic work, basically. After our energetic start in January, we haven't come very far yet, but after 5 years, I've learned to be grateful for movement. So while continuing to push for structures, we have come to some conclusions and a way forward in our last working group meeting. That was only last Monday. And we also did receive follow-up from my CEO, and I have it in writing that the code is going to be now considered and written into the new strategy 2027 to 2032, which is currently being developed. And we've been asked and have developed KPIs for managers that have now been shared with our CEO for consideration at our next meeting. So I really feel a real step forward, which is just great. We've also agreed a plan to get real staff engagement and how we will be working on our action points without putting too much extra work on different departments in the organisation. So I'm now going to hand you over to Phoebe, who will give you some of hers and Patrick's feedback. Patrick is unfortunately not here today because he took the wise decision to take annual leave when the weather is so nice. But Phoebe has agreed to do his bit. So Phoebe, I hand over to you for the next slide.
Great. Thanks, Birgit. And yeah, I'll start out by filling in for Patrick, who is one of our infrastructure officers on our Safe Routes to School team. And the Safe Routes to School program is aimed at helping get primary and post-primary students walking, cycling, scooting to school. And they kind of have three different approaches to that. So accelerating the delivery of infrastructure for walking and cycling on the key routes to schools, making access at the school itself better for people walking, cycling, and scooting, and also increasing bike and scooter parking at schools. And so what you see here is an idea that Patrick and the SRTS team have developed for how they and An Taisce could approach a code of good practice self-assessment. They haven't completed it yet, but it's a framework that they're developing that they can use, but also that other programs within An Taisce can use. So the proposal here kind of maps Safe Routes to Schools work against all 12 of the principles using a three-round process. So that's identifying evidence, surfacing gaps, and assigning ownership, and turning that into a live action plan, not just a one-off audit. So the framework follows 5 stages, and we'll use an example from the Safe Routes to School program because it illustrates each one pretty well. So, starting out with empathizing and with lived experience. So, kids and families whose daily reality is really shaped by unsafe streets and car-dependent systems that they didn't choose, as well as unequal access to active travel. So then we move on to defining. Um, so, looking at root causes, who gets heard in planning decisions about infrastructure? Whose safety is prioritized? And how does power operate at a local level? And then ideate is where critical thinking really comes in. And this is kind of challenging car-centric assumptions with communities and asking, why is it like this? What could it be instead? How do walking, cycling, and shared space all come into view here? So then we start creating solutions, co-creating solutions through prototyping. So that's kids, parents, schools, local partners. They don't just get consulted, they actively help shape what gets built. And that process is development education in and of itself. And finally, testing, reflecting, where we look at what changed, who benefited, and what still does need attention after that. And that learning feeds back into future projects and into Antashka's wider practice. And even with that, reflective notes aren't always archived, marginalized voices aren't consistently captured, and evidence still sits in silos. So this framework is designed to name that and assign ownership to fix it. And with this, the ambition is to make the Code of Good Practice a genuine reflective tool across all of Antashka and not just a compliance exercise where we tick a box. So we definitely welcome your input on shaping that. And that goes for both Patrick and myself. So that's Safe Routes to School. Um, and now just want to have another look at where I think that, because I completely agree with Patrick that the code can really become a genuine reflective tool across Antashka's huge range of work. And part of that includes advocacy, which is where I work. And that's focused on environmental policy advocacy in a range of areas, climate, biodiversity restoration, water quality, energy, you name it. Um, and we also have a role as a statutory consultee in the Irish planning system. So essentially, whenever a planning application might impact the environment or built heritage, we are consulted. We're not a decision maker, but we get to express our views. So advocacy isn't explicitly an education focused part of Antashka, but I think the code really can be a strong tool for us to focus our own work through a lens of global and local justice and also helping us reflect and improve on that. So in our policy work, um, you know, we can use the code to look at how environmental law and policy in Ireland and the EU better address global justice issues, equity issues. Like if we're making a policy submissions with recommendations for the next Meath County Council development plan, are our policy positions and our recommendations actually addressing the root causes of injustice and inequality? And how can planning policy in Meath help make development more sustainable and more equitable? That's just one example. Um, Another, how are power relations operating, in the context of a particular policy? How can we address that in our recommendations? So we work a lot on the issue of data centers and their energy and climate impacts, which has kind of become a very prominent national issue recently. And we focus a lot in that on the issue of power relations and inequalities in our energy system. So, who is our energy for? And who's bearing the cost of rapidly expanding these power-hungry data centers? So, but the code can also help us reflect on our work. And, if as we make policy recommendations, have we incorporated diverse and challenging perspectives? Have we thought through how our own biases are shaping what we're advocating for to policymakers? And finally, another aspect of our work is around empowering the public and communities to understand and be able to exercise their rights to participate in policymaking processes, including the planning process. And we do that primarily through things like workshops and webinars. And I think various code principles like 5, 6, 7, 9 can help us a lot there. Like, how are we centering participants? Are there groups or views or perspectives that we're missing? What opportunities are there for co-creation? How can we better gather feedback and incorporate that into our work? So those are just a few examples, and it's still early days for advocacy in terms of thinking about how to use the code most effectively in our work. But I think there's absolutely huge potential there. And Brigette's absolutely right that, we were some of the ones at the beginning that said, "Now this is great, this code, but we don't do education work. So that's great, but it's not relevant to us." So wrong. And I'm really glad that now that I've become involved in the working group because I think I've really become aware recently and started thinking about how we can apply the code to advocacy work because I think it's a very powerful tool and can certainly help us improve our work and also contribute to kind of the wider goals of An Taisce. So I'll turn it back over to you, Brigitte.
Thanks so much, Phoebe. So now I'll just give you a very quick version of the lessons. You can read them on the slide, but I want to highlight two in particular. First, the language. Language matters more than you'd hope. I particularly know that as a non-native English speaker, even after 35 years, I still have trouble finding the right words in some situations, and that erodes confidence. So this has also been an individual journey. Presenting the Code of Good Practice as a GCE quality framework opened some doors. Presenting it as part of our strategic positioning and government partnerships opened different, often wider doors. And I'm not proud of that is true, but it is true. And a lot of pushing as well from our side. And then also the second most important lesson I learned is that goodwill is not a system. I got a lot of goodwill along the way, colleagues who said the right things, new colleagues jumping into support, managers who were encouraging, even a CEO who turned up to a working group meeting and said all the right things, which is really commendable and great. And we were delighted to have all that support and to have our CEO involved in the working group, which is really great because we know that he is really busy. But goodwill is without a structure evaporates. So without a mandate and a working group embedded reporting job descriptions that include the code of good practice, it stays as one person's projects indefinitely. And that brings me to where we are now. We are moving. So yes, it was hard. We had our first working group meeting, and it felt like a breakthrough to me because it took me nearly 2 full years to get the go ahead, and then another 6 months and a few harsh words as well, and to get the working group going. Then we had a fantastic first meeting. There was a lot of energy in the room. It was brilliant to have our CEO there who was able to explain from a different perspectives, and that was really, really great. And then the silence came. We were all busy. We didn't have time to have another working meeting. We put the self-assessment together. We read the feedback. We tried to act on that, come up with some ideas. But then now where we are is that the follow-up is very slowly coming, and which is great. And I'm not criticizing the organization or anyone here, but it's just actual structural institutional change takes a lot of energy and a lot of hard work. Not being afraid to pester people and to just keep going when you believe in something. And I have to say that from the first presentation that I saw the Code of Good Practice when it was launched in December 2019, I just believed in it and I just kept on going with it. And we have a very solid group. We had an amazing meeting on Monday with follow up from our CEO in writing, and next meeting is set for September. And yeah, I am looking forward to where this is going to go. But yes, it's not easy. But I am delighted that we are where we are. So I end with a question, I suppose, because we are here to learn as well, and to what has worked in your organization. I knew, is there anything that you got from this presentation? If you say, well, maybe you could do this differently or that differently. Like we'd love to hear from everyone because we can keep on learning as well. But yeah, it's great to have an army around me now to do this, and I'm very grateful for that. So it's great. That's it.